Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. When we hear the words Ottoman Empire, our minds almost instantly jump to magnificent palaces, elite janissary guards, and the epic conquests of grand sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent. But today, we're taking a little detour. We are going to look completely past all of that and focus on what life was actually like for a commoner in the Ottoman Empire. How did a regular person live, work, and survive? We're going to uncover the remarkably dynamic, ground-level reality of the everyday people who literally built and sustained this massive 600-year empire.
We've got plenty of ground to cover today. Here is our roadmap. 1. Meet the Riaya. 2. The agrarian engine. 3. Living in the millet system. 4. Women and the law. 5. Diet and homes. And finally, 6. Culture and coffee houses. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. The taxpayers. Meet the Riaya. Now, to truly understand a day in the life of an Ottoman commoner, you first have to grasp the fundamental, unshakable divide of their society.
Our focus today is entirely on a group known as the Riaya. Literally translating to the flock, the Riaya were the tax-paying subjects of the empire. They made up the vast majority of the population. We're talking about the agrarian, peasant farmers, the urban craftsmen, and the local merchants. Their physical labor and, crucially, the taxes they paid were the financial lifeblood of the entire imperial machine. Without them, well, those grand conquests just wouldn't have been funded at all.
So, society was basically split right down the middle into two distinct groups. On one side, you had the askeri. These were the ruling political and military elite, and get this, they were completely tax-exempt. On the other side were the riaya, who were heavily taxed and purposefully kept disarmed. This stark contrast was actually held together by a paternalistic philosophy they called the circle of justice. The logic went like this. The sultan's absolute power relied on the military relied on the treasury, and the treasury relied entirely on the taxes of the riaya. So, the riaya had to be protected by the sultan's justice in order to keep producing wealth. It was basically a massive, self-sustaining loop.
Moving on to Section 2, the agrarian engine. For most of these commoners, daily life wasn't spent wandering the bustling bazaars of Istanbul. It was rooted deeply in the dirt.
Everything was driven by a highly structured agricultural machine called the Çift-Han system. This was the absolute core of the Ottoman agrarian economy, and it was built on three distinct pillars. First, you have the Hana, which basically meant a single peasant family and their capacity for labor. Second is the Çift, which was the exact amount of land that could be plowed by one pair of yoked oxen. And third is Miri, meaning the land itself was actually owned by the state, not by a bunch of wealthy nobles. Essentially, the empire handed a family a perfectly sized plot of land to farm forever. Why? Well, it was a deliberate choice to prevent the rise of massive feudal lords, preserving a huge, stable class of independent peasant families across the empire.
But here's the catch. Being part of this system wasn't exactly a choice. It was an obligation. The state kept an incredibly tight grip on mobility, because if a peasant just packed up and left, it instantly threatened the empire's tax revenue. The rules were intense. Leave your land uncultivated for 3 years, you lose it completely. Abandon your farm to try and find a better job in the city, they'd slap you with a harsh, punitive fine called the Çift Bozan. And most wild of all, if a family actually did manage to sneak away, their remaining neighbors were legally forced to cover their missing taxes. As you can imagine, this created a fierce system of self-policing. Everyone was heavily invested in making sure their neighbors stayed put and kept plowing. All right, Section 3, living in the millet system. So we know how they farmed, but how in the world did millions of ethnically and religiously diverse commoners actually live together without tearing the empire apart? Imagine having to stop and figure out which legal system applied to you before you even left your house in the morning. That was a huge part of everyday life. Ottoman commoners essentially navigated two completely parallel legal traditions. For your private, domestic life, things like marriage, divorce, and inheritance, you followed Sharia, or Islamic law. But for everything else, there was Kanun. These were secular decrees issued directly by the Sultan to govern public affairs, taxation, and criminal law. And the empire was incredibly diverse. To manage this, non-Muslim subjects, like the Greek Orthodox, Armenians, and Jews, operated under something called the millet system. The empire actually granted these specific religious communities a ton of autonomy to run their own affairs. They were allowed to manage their own religious schools and even run their own local courts for family law. In exchange for this protection and independence, non-Muslim men paid a special tax called the jizya. Now sure, it wasn't equal citizenship by modern democratic standards, but for the era, it was a remarkably structured and stable system of coexistence.
Section 4.
Women, property, and the law. When we move into the domestic sphere, the reality for women was far more empowering than the strict patriarchal rules of the era might have you think.
Prepare to have some assumptions challenged here. 60%, despite rigid social codes that restricted their movement at night and required conservative clothing in public, women were incredibly active in the legal system. Under Sharia law, women were legally recognized as completely independent entities. That means they didn't need a husband or a father's permission to buy or sell property or to manage their own inheritances. And when they went to family court to file for financial maintenance or pursue a divorce, historical records show they actually won roughly 60% of their cases. No way, right?
And this really illustrates their growing economic power. Just look at the commercial hub city of Bursa. Between the years 1600 and 1700, female property and probate suits increased by a staggering 300%. Female economic assertiveness literally exploded over the century. Women weren't just passively sitting at home. They were out there operating as vital, independent weavers, silk spinners, and dyers. They earned their own capital and actively defended that hard-earned wealth right in front of local judges.
Section 5. Diet, Homes, and Neighborhoods. We've talked about their labor and their laws, but what did it actually look and taste like to be an everyday Ottoman commoner?
Well, day-to-day survival was pretty modest. Your daily staple was dark, really dense bread made of barley or rye. Forget about eating steak every night, meat was an absolute luxury. Usually, you only ate it when an old plow animal had to be put down, and then it was heavily salted and preserved as pastorma. People lived in simple, timber frame homes packed tightly onto narrow, unpaved streets. But they were incredibly supported by their neighborhoods, which were known as mahalles. Think of these mahalles as early crowdfunding or mutual aid networks. Centuries before modern welfare, these communities created funds where slightly wealthier residents chipped in to help pay taxes for the poor, the widows, and the orphans. It was a real safety net.
But looking at all of this, the heavy taxes, the super strict agrarian laws, the dense neighborhoods, the rigid social hierarchy, it really makes you wonder, where did the common people go to actually relax? Where could they escape the watchful eyes of the state and just have a bit of fun?
That brings us to Section 6, coffeehouses, hammams, and culture. The answer lies in a vibrant explosion of public spaces that leveled the playing field for absolutely everyone.
Before indoor plumbing, keeping clean was a strict civic and religious duty. So everyone gathered at the local hammam, or public bathhouse. Inherited from the Romans and absolutely perfected by master architects like Mimar Sinan, these places were stunning. But they weren't just for getting clean. They were the absolute epicenter of local gossip, matchmaking, and fierce political debate. Under those grand domes, you'd find rich merchants and poor artisans washing right side by side.
But the real game changer in commoner life, that was the coffeehouse. By the early 19th century, Istanbul alone had over 2,500 coffeehouses. For the ordinary guy whose timber home was way too small to host guests, this was the ultimate social equalizer. It gave them a space completely outside the boundaries of the mosque and outside the duties of the home. Here, they could spend hours mixing with folks from all different backgrounds, drinking deep roasted coffee, and just sharing ideas.
In the coffeehouse was essentially the theater of the masses. Through a thick haze of fragrant coffee and tobacco smoke, commoners would sit and watch Meddah storytellers and Kargo's shadow puppets. These shows were wildly popular because they used brilliant, high-energy slapstick satire to openly mock corrupt judges, overbearing officials, and the pompous elite. It was this rare, surprisingly tolerated outlet for public criticism, giving everyday people a collective voice and a much-needed laugh at the expense of their rulers.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We so often measure the greatness of historical empires by the sweeping conquests of their sultans or the sheer size of their military. But when you look at the deeply resilient agrarian systems, the incredible agency of women fighting for their rights in court, and the vibrant, fiercely independent culture of the coffeehouses, it kind of makes you rethink history entirely, doesn't it? Were the grand sultans the true architects of this 600-year empire? Or was its enduring strength actually built on the backs, the resilience, and the fascinating everyday lives of the common people? Something to think about. Keep exploring, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.